Every so often, you come across a book so enthralling that you literally finish it in one sitting. That is Stoner by John Williams. I just finished reading this book this morning, and I cannot wait to talk with you all about it. First came to Stoner because I saw a couple of people on social media post about the book, a couple of influencers, if you will, bookstagrammers, who posted about Stoner. These were people whose taste I tend to trust, I tend to respect, and one creator in particular actually ranked Stoner the #1 American classic of all time. The #1 American classic above in the ranks of Catcher in the Rye, The Great Gatsby, Hemingway books, Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut, you know, like these are real classic novels. I saw Tay Rosen rank Stoner #1 American classic of all time, and that is a bold claim, and it piqued my interest. So I picked it up. I got a copy, and it honestly sat on my TBR pile for a while because I have not been reading much lately, but I'm so glad I got back into the reading game with this book. This was exactly what I needed. Just the kind of book that I'm not lying, I opened it and I did not put it down until I was on the last page. I actually read it in one sitting. It took maybe 4 hours to get through. I annotated the book in this bluish highlighter. I actually was so into this book that I dog-eared some of the pages. I actually was so moved by some of the pages in this book that I dog-eared them. I do not dog-ear the pages of my books, but this book is so good and hits so hard that you can't help but save that page beyond just a highlight and a star and a bracket. You gotta really mark that territory and dog-ear the page. It's that good. So in brief, Stoner follows a character named William Stoner, who is a farm boy from a small rural town in Missouri. William Stoner enters university, which he did not think was going to be his path in life. He thought that he was going to work on his family's farm forever. He never expected to pursue higher education, but his dad, I was going to say encourages him to pursue higher education. The real of it is that his father basically says, you're gonna go to college. I think it's gonna be good for you. Never imagined it before for our family, but I think it's gonna be the best thing for you to do is to go to college. So his father sends him off to university where he is to study agriculture. And in his first couple of years or year at school, in his first year at school, he studies agriculture, he takes science classes, he does decent in them, he's decently interested in the classes, but then he takes a gen ed English class and he completely falls in love with literature. So he switches his discipline, he switches his field of study, his course of study, and instead enrolls in philosophy and literature. And this change from studying agriculture to studying literature and liberal arts changes the course of William Stoner's entire life. He continues to study through his 4-year degree, working at a family friend's farm in the mornings and on weekends, doing laborious work on the farm, then going to school and then coming home and doing his studies. And he gets through his bachelor's that way. And then his advisor sort of character at school recommends that Stoner continue pursuing higher education, get a master's, get a PhD, and be a teacher, a professor of literature. Stoner continues his studies. He ultimately becomes an English professor. He gets married, he teaches, he has a child with his wife, he suffers. The plot is spare yet embodied, if that is even possible. Stoner endures personal and professional hardships. He endures isolation. He endures what turns out to be a loveless marriage. He also experiences glimpses of real joy and true love and literature and poetry and beauty. The thing about this novel is its diligent attention to a man's life, rendered with aching clarity. Stoner was published in 1965, written by John Williams. John Williams remains a writer's writer. He's not terribly well known, but he's admired by novelists. But the general public doesn't know John Williams' name as well as Ernest Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald or even Jack Kerouac or some other writers of his time. John Williams' body of work is relatively small. He published 4 books in his life, but he was also, like William Stoner, a professor of English. He was very familiar with academia, and that familiarity with academia informs this book, Stoner, from the institutional politics of universities to the compromises professors have to make to the yearnings of professors, especially professors in the liberal arts. John Williams once said that he wanted to write books that were honest, not necessarily in a factual sense, but in a moral and emotional sense. Stoner is a pure expression of that goal. Mission accomplished, goal achieved. When Stoner was first released, it barely registered. It sold moderately and actually went out of print. It was in obscurity for years. It was published in 1965, as I mentioned, and it wasn't until the early 2000s when the book had a renaissance of sorts, particularly in France and the Netherlands. At that point, the book began to find its audience. Today, Stoner is often described as a lost classic. I tend to agree with that categorization of this novel. It is truly a masterpiece of understated prose. I am confident enough to call Stoner a perfect novel. It is perfect. People say the perfect book doesn't exist. I'll show you a perfect book. It's right here. It is a perfect book. Not for its melodrama or for its sensationalism, not in the slightest, but for its restraint. It's not quite modernist. It's not quite postmodern. It subscribes to tradition, one that values character over concept and values lucid fluidity, which is, if you know me, the highest compliment I can give a book, saying that it is lucid and fluid. That is how I describe a book that reads to me like water. I don't even know how to describe what that means, but it just flows like water. And that's this book. It's just one of those books where one word after the next, you are in it. And the prose is so beautiful that it never takes you out of the world that's built. And it's a very descriptive novel. It's often building the world that these characters are inhabiting and placing you in it with really vivid detail. It never loses you. I had a writing instructor give me advice. It was in a legal writing class when I was in law school. And the writing teacher said, if your reader has to read a sentence twice, you've lost your argument. So if you write a brief for the court and the judge reads a sentence and then has to read it again because the judge didn't quite understand what you were getting at or what point you were trying to make or what that sentence was conveying, you've lost your argument. I mean, there's a difference between a sentence that you have to read a few times over because it's just so impactful and it's complex and dynamic and interesting, and you want to read it again because you want to really soak it in. There's a difference between going back and rereading a sentence in that way, and then when you technically, grammatically, just the flow is off and you read a sentence and you go, what? I have to read that again. And then I have to read it again. What is this writer trying to say to me? That is, you failed. You've lost your argument. You failed your mission. I never once had to go back and reread a sentence in this book, and I never reread a sentence because I didn't understand it or because it threw the flow of the book off. I only went back to reread sentences because they packed a punch and I wanted to soak it in another time. And so this book, it values the character that is William Stoner over the concept of what the novel is doing. It values the lucid fluidity of the prose over experimentation with form or substance. What makes Stoner so quietly radical is its refusal to inflate its protagonist. There's no grand arc of redemption, no sweeping transformation. Stoner lives, he works, he studies, he teaches, he falters. He never really wins. He loses more than he ever wins. And yet, I walk away from this novel not feeling a sense of tragedy for Stoner, but rather dignity and integrity and stoicism. Stoner, as a book, asks a question. Is a simple, uncelebrated life worthy of literature? The answer to that question is unequivocally yes. The novel's greatness lies not in what happens. There's no great big fight scene. There's no murder. There's no dramatic, larger-than-life events. I'm going to note here that Stoner reminds me a lot of a film called Boyhood, directed by Richard Linklater. Boyhood is a film which I don't want to get into it too much because you're not here to get a synopsis and analysis of Boyhood, but it's a phenomenal film that was filmed over the course of like 12 years with the same actors, and it filmed these actors at different stages of their lives as they aged. The film aged with the actors to capture moments in time, and every scene from a different year featured sort of time capsule period piece, like let's capture the essence of what's on the radio right now, what games are the kids playing, what are people wearing, and it really captured a 12-year span of time. It's a relatively long film. Nothing remarkable really happens. People get together, have kids, get divorced, co-parent, or at least share custody of those kids, get into new relationships, experience domestic violence, send their kids off to college. There's no big one. There's no big scene in Boyhood. That's what I love about Boyhood, and in that sense, Stoner, as I was reading it, reminded me a lot of Boyhood. I'm just following the life of William Stoner. I'm just reading about this man's unremarkable, simple, normal, average, typical American life in the early 20th century. This novel's greatness lies not in what happens, but in how Stoner sees it. It is that painful honesty of this novel that elevates Stoner into the canon of American literature. It's not a grand statement, but it is a quiet revelation. From the novel's early pages, Stoner's stoicism shines through strikingly. When Stoner's father decides to send him away to university to study agriculture, he arranges for Stoner to live in a home on a farm with a family friend, the Foots. And to pay his way through school and to earn his room and board at the Foots' farm, Stoner labors on the farm. He wakes up early in the morning and performs farm work, and then he goes to school, and then he comes home and he studies and he does his schoolwork, goes to sleep, wakes up, repeat. He doesn't complain. He doesn't consider himself a martyr. He just quietly endures. And that stoicism he carries with him through every chapter of his life. The thesis of the novel, to me, is actually a handful of sentences on page 219. Williams writes, "Deep in him, beneath his memory, was the knowledge of hardship and hunger and endurance and pain. Though he seldom thought of his early years on the Boonville farm, there was always near his consciousness the bold knowledge of his inheritance given him by forefathers whose lives were obscure and hard and stoical, and whose common ethic was to present to an oppressive world faces that were expressionless and hard and bleak." He inherited that stoicness, and he inherited from his forefathers an ethic in which you face the hard world with a hard face that is expressionless and bleak. I can't even break that down because I think it really speaks for itself. My initial impression of Stoner from the jump was that he was just stoic. There's a line in here in which he says he, got through certain years of his life the way you would drive through a torrential downpour, just white knuckling it, head down, and jaw clenched. And that is how he got through his life. And that is evident from the early pages of the book, whether he's on his family's farm at home as a young person or as a university student at the Foot farm, or going through the trenches of academia, or enduring a loveless marriage, or dealing with a colleague that he has an adversarial relationship with. All these things, these trials and tribulations he goes through, he just grins and bears it. My initial instinct upon reading this book and taking in Stoner's stoicism was to admire him, to read his silence as strength. His stoicism felt noble, almost virtuous. That was my initial reaction, and my next thought, upon just a moment of reflection, I questioned, is stoicism always strength? Stoner suffers deeply, but he rarely protests. He rarely asks to be seen. And while his emotional self-containment gives this novel power, at least some of its power, it also asks or begs a question. What is the cost of refusing to speak one's pain? What is lost when a person chooses to endure rather than to confront? Is stoicism always the noble, virtuous high ground? Anyway, this tension between restraint and vulnerability is what makes Stoner feel so contemporary despite its mid-century setting. It gestures quietly toward the way that some forms of strength, toxic masculinity, is indistinguishable from self-denial. If you read books for the plot, Stoner may not be for you. I personally enjoy reading books for the aesthetics, for the vibes. Think My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Not much going on plot-wise, but vibes, aesthetics. I love that book, one of my favorites of all time. And reading Stoner did make me think of My Brilliant Friend, just in that you're just following a normal life. So if you read for the plot, if you're a new release bestseller, romance, fantasy, adventure, action type of reader, Stoner is not for you. But if you are someone who reads good writing for the sake of good writing, and if you read for the slow accumulation of meaning, then this novel will stick with you. Thank you so much for spending a few moments with Stoner and me. If you've read this book. I would love to hear more about how it sat with you. And if you haven't, maybe it's time to let a quiet book low-key devastate you. Until next time, peace and love.